All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our August EMG webinar. Before we get started, this session is being recorded and then will be posted to our EMG webinar archive on the Master Gardener website. I will post that link in the chat box for everyone. If you have questions for our speaker, please type them into the chat box. And he said that he'd be willing to address those during the session, and then we'll also leave some room at the end of the session as well to answer those questions. And so with that, let's go ahead and introduce our speaker, Tyler Urgo. Tyler works for the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation in the Division of Natural Heritage as the Shenandoah Valley Regional Steward. Welcome, Tyler. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you guys for having me. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about natural heritage as a whole, how we fit into DCR and kind of the things that we do. We'll look at a few projects that we're working on from my section. I'll describe that kind of later, the different sections we have within natural heritage. Then we'll just take some questions at the end, and also feel free during. As Kathleen said, we're pretty informal with this, so feel free to jump in and ask a question, and I'll see it pop up, I think, here. And if not, I'll take a peek every now and then. So again, my name is Tyler Urgo, and I work for DCR in the Natural Heritage Division there. I started out my career actually with Department of Game and Inland Fisheries at the time, who is now Department of Wildlife Resources. So I worked there for about 8 years, working on the wildlife management area system. So working on building habitat and maintaining infrastructure and things of that nature there for them. And then 2.5 years ago, took the position I'm in now with DCR. Just give you a little background there. Also, previous to that, just had a lifelong interest in natural resources and wildlife, and grew up in Augusta County here in Virginia, between the Blue Ridge and the Alleghenies here, and so spent lots of time out in the woods and streams and getting dirty and just enjoying, what the state has to offer. That kind of spurned my passion and interest into the natural resource field. So from there, I went on and got an environmental science degree at James Madison University, and then a master's in wildlife science from Texas A&M after that. So from there, I jumped into my career path from that point. So little background here with DCR. So you see the picture on the slide here. This is our entire division, essentially. So within DCR, we have state parks and natural heritage and a couple other divisions in the mix too, but those are the two you're probably most familiar with. And a lot of people don't know that we have a natural heritage division, and what does that even mean? What are we? We're a pretty small group of people, as you can see from the photo here, for an entire division. There's not too many of us, but we're split up within that into 3 kind of key groups: our inventory section, our protection section, and our stewardship section. So going into the presentation here, we'll kind of just kind of go over generally, why natural heritage exists, what we do, and how we do those things. Since I am myself working in the stewardship section, I'll kind of focus on a few projects that I'm excited about that or take up a good part of my job here in the recent past, and we would like to kind of share with you guys. So kind of have a little bit of focus on that, but I'll give you a little bit of background on our other sections as well. So let's move on here. We'll jump to the next slide. So just going to give you a general overview quickly here, and I promise I'm not going to pound you with a bunch of wordy PowerPoint slides. I know it can be brutal to get through them. So there'll be some slides here we'll just go through, and just to give you an idea from the standpoint of what we're about. So there was an act passed in 1989 that kind of established the need and legally the the system of natural area preserves and then the division to manage them. So we have a preserve system across the state that's covers, I think, about 60-some thousand acres in total that resulted from this act, that's aimed at protecting rare and unique and endangered ecosystems, habitats, species specifically, communities as a whole. And you'll see some of those examples as we go. So that's really the intent here. The three divisions we have are protection, inventory, and stewardship. So our protection division focuses on primarily like land acquisitions or easements. So we may buy a property outright that contains a super unique community that's ranked pretty highly in rarity that we would want to protect. And so we would add that to our natural area preserve system by purchasing the land. We also work with landowners that may want to have an easement on their property. It's a lifetime agreement for that property in perpetuity that it will be protected and managed under our system, but the ownership of that property still remains with the landowner. And that easement's transferable through time to owners in the future. So that just kind of gives you a quick hit there of that system, and then how our protection division fits into that, which is just 3 people. So it's not a real big division, but they're pretty critical in securing land purchases for us throughout the state. Our inventory section includes our specialists, so our zoologists, our ecologists, entomologists, those folks that have a unique skill set and education in helping to manage an inventory, obviously, and document, record, and share and create data from their observations for us as a division. So they're pretty critical as well. And then stewardship, of course. So stewardship are those of us who actually will manage the NAP system, so the lands themselves, doing habitat enhancements for certain species. We do have some what we call open access preserves for the public to come hike or bike or visit. We have a handful of those scattered throughout the state, and so we also manage public access for those as well. We'll give some examples of that as we go along here. So natural heritage resources. So essentially the habitat of rare, threatened, or endangered plant or animal species, rare significant natural communities or geologic sites, and similar features of scientific interest benefiting the welfare of the citizens of the Commonwealth. So that's kind of our driving, guiding statement there of what our intent is and what we're trying to do. So across the state, we have now, this is outdated and always changing, over 9,000 populations of rare plants and animals, so 625 total species and 194 vertebrates and 233 total communities. So as I'll show you in another slide coming up here, we're in a very diverse place here, especially in the western part of the state. Just species richness as a whole is very high. And let's see right here. So just to branch out a little bit, just looking at why we're worried or concerned about biodiversity. I think this shouldn't be news to anyone, but globally we're seeing declines in biodiversity, pretty steep ones. So this just kind of give you a picture of the need for protecting these natural features, especially to Virginia, since we're here in Virginia. But just to paint the picture for you of the need, we're seeing significant declines throughout the world in our total biodiversity. And so that's kind of a driving force for us to want to continue the work we're doing to protect and enhance these native communities and species that we have left. And just to give you an idea of some threats, and one project I'll show you, we've got some maps, I'll show you kind of a real-time example of the threats to biodiversity. But in North America, one of our biggest threats, as you can see here, is just changes in land use. The conversion of natural lands to subdivisions or commercial facilities or other things that can never go back. Once they become concrete and asphalt, it's pretty much a given they're going to stay that way. So that is one of our bigger threats, is the changes in our land use here. And that, again, probably shouldn't surprise many of you that that's the case. So it is a constant battle for us, for sure. So here's a map. This is species richness of across the U.S. here. And you can see the brighter colored areas in the yellows and the reds and the pinks. So these areas here, if you can see my laser pointer, are really high in species richness. And you can see, so this is Virginia here in this area. And this kind of stripe of yellow specifically is the Allegheny Highlands of Virginia. So we have a very high density there of species in that area. So again, no pressure on us, but it's just interesting to note that we are in a very historically and what was a very diverse place when it comes to flora and fauna. All right, so just talk a little bit about kind of the process we go through to protect biological diversity here. One of our main starting points is collecting ecological data. We need something to make a decision off of about what's threatened, what's imperiled, what's not. Where do we focus our time and our energy and our effort? And so kind of the beginning of that is just collecting data. And so inventory section is pretty key in this, and they travel throughout the state, public, private lands, all over to collect data on potential rare threatened species that we're particularly interested in. So we start with that data collection, and then beyond that, we manage those with databases. We kind of put them into a system that we can analyze and tease out information from. And then from there, we take that kind of three ways. We may share that data with external stakeholders. So an example of that would be we are asked to consult on projects that VDOT, Virginia Department of Transportation, may be working on a road that may go through an area with some potentially rare communities. And they may consult with us, and we will look at our databases and share with them the information we have on, hey, there's this particular plant that's along this roadway you need to be concerned about, and take mitigation measures to avoid damaging that community, either moving the road or other strategies that may be employed. So that's kind of one way we use that information that we have. And the other way, of course, is to design protection strategies. So where do we buy land? Why are we buying that property? And do we have good backing and data to support that decision for a land purchase? Those are some big moves. They obviously come with a lot of money involved to buy. So we really need to have a good solid foundation for why do we want to buy this property and have the state manage it, for the rest of time. So pretty big decisions there that need some good factual data behind them. And the third way is just also using that to manage the lands that we have through stewardship and develop restoration strategies for those properties. And so you'll see some examples here in a little bit of some of those projects that these data that we've collected kind of drive what we do and why we do it there on the lands that we manage. So just to give you an idea of what we've got throughout the state, here is a list and a map of all of our properties in our regions. So the tan colored region there, which is kind of that northwest corner of the state, that's my region, the Shenandoah Valley region. And all of the dots you see there are the properties that we own and manage, or our easements as well are listed in there. The blue dots are public access available. So that means we've developed infrastructure to support visitation. So we'll have trail systems and maps and trail markers and information on our websites about what you can do there. And so those are scattered kind of throughout the state. The red dots are the ones that have a rare community or a specific plant or something that we're really trying to protect and is sensitive to overuse or visitation, in which I'll show you an example of that coming up as well. But those are, kind of, they're not advertised. They don't contain developed infrastructure to support people visiting them, but they are still open to the public. They would just have to, arrange a visit of some sort with the regional steward to have controlled access to that property to avoid having resource damage. And a lot of times that's something we're always on the lookout for. On our open access preserves is just the traffic flow. And recently, given COVID and everyone being home for the last year and just not being able to be at concerts or in public spaces, they've all flocked to public lands and really put some immense pressure over the last year on public lands. So we've seen a huge increase in visitor usage in the recent past. So we'll jump in here and give you some examples of some projects that Stewardship is working on. This particular site is Cowbane Prairie Natural Area Preserve, and that's in my region here in the Shenandoah Valley. Not a large property, about 136 acres total, but contains some remnant pieces community-wise and some remnant species from what would have been there's a wet and a dry prairie component to this of Virginia in the past. And this is one of the more interesting quotes here that is thought-provoking from some historical accounts from early visitors to the Shenandoah Valley. And you can see the quote there, and just thinking about buffalo and elk and wolves and mountain lions roaming this part of the state is just kind of hard to imagine. We haven't seen those species here in a very long time. And obviously the landscape is very different than it was when these first explorers and settlers of the area made these observations. So at Cowbane, we've got this kind of postage stamp here, an oasis amongst a lot of encroachment, development, and again, we talked about the land use pressures. We'll look at the map here. So the yellow outline is the boundary of our property here. So you can see where my laser pointer is. This area along here is the South River, which is a tributary of the Shenandoah River. And so along here we have what we call our wet fen or wet prairies too. So two different community groups there that hold an assemblage of plants that are disjunct from other populations of these species, typically found in the Midwest. So historically, you would have seen a lot of these species more, spread out more throughout the valley before, early settlers came in and started converting the land for agriculture. But this contains, I think, upwards of 20 different rare plant species. I'll show you some examples here in a minute. In this wet fen, it's because of its moisture, this is primarily why it exists. So the moisture kept it from being cultivated and being planted in corn and wheat or whatever other row crops at the time would have been farmed here. So it saved it in a sense from having that soil disturbed and turned over, and the plant communities lost to that. So to the north here, there's a field. You can kind of see a boundary around that. So these are two of our upland prairie sites. So this field here where my cursor is now also was never cultivated to our knowledge and from historical record, and contains a host of upland prairie species, grasses and forbs, and a few handful of rare plants as well. So I'll show you in a minute here. We're doing so the title of the last slide was Grassland Restoration. So this triangular shaped field at the top of the screen here, about 20 years ago, was planted in a specific ecotype of big blue stem, a warm season grass that was from Missouri, and it was planted at a pretty high density. And so we saw this field become just a monoculture of 8-foot tall big blue stem grass. And so yes, that ecotype is native to the United States, but it's not native to Virginia. itself. So this is where our restoration efforts have focused here. And I'll get into that a little more and show you some photos of that process and how that restoration takes place. But also you can notice we talked about threats to biodiversity and land use changes. You can see the subdivision to the kind of off to the south of the property here, and kind of coming right up to our boundary. This area here, my cursor is now, these old agricultural fields are kind of down along the river bottom. We're slated for development as well before we purchased them. They had actually run stormwater management drains and fire hydrants that are scattered all through here. And it was slated for another couple hundred homes to be placed there. So these fields in this area hold pretty high potential for restoring the communities that we find on the other side of the river that haven't been disturbed. So we were very fortunate to be able to come in and snag that property before it all turned into a subdivision there. Just to give you a little backstory on the property, these are, the areas, one of the areas that we're managing, one NAP as an example here to kind of get started. I'm going to take a quick look at the chat here. So we have a few questions. Yeah, how much of the time is spent in invasive management? A lot. So we will get into that later. It's kind of a triage process for us with invasives. We really have to evaluate each one that we find and kind of decide what's the biggest threat, what's really a threat, and then how do we manage. If we looked at all of our invasives as a whole, it'd be an overwhelming task that I'm not sure we'd ever surmount. So there's kind of a process we go through and decide what we treat, where we treat, and why we treat. So I'll get into that to a little more depth later when we talk about a specific project at another site called Buffalo Mountain Natural Area Preserve. And there is really no minimum acreage for land preservation. That was another question here. It just depends. It depends on the site. We have some as small as a few acres. It may contain, an example would be a Shenandoah Valley sinkhole pond. So that's a pond that may be 50 feet across, but contains a species like Virginia sneezeweed, which is a globally rare plant that only grows in sinkhole pond communities in 2 or 3 different places in the US. And so if we have the opportunity to pick up a couple acres that include that specific type of rare, unique feature, then we will. But it's most common that we try to purchase the surrounding lands as well, because obviously the land use around features like that also matter. And so the more we can protect that kind of ecotone surrounding that unique feature, the better off we are as far as the integrity of that community we want to protect. And then just one other here, so I talk about climate change. Yeah, that's definitely something that's more and more becoming a discussion for sure. And so when we kind of put together our strategic plans, we sit down annually and kind of review our direction as a division. What are our priorities, bigger picture things. We all sit down and kind of brainstorm through what are upcoming and new threats and what are things we need to start preparing for now as best we can. And so climate change definitely is playing into that. We definitely are seeing impacts from that without a doubt. So, how do we deal with those? And moving forward, how do we plan for managing in an uncertain future when it comes to the impacts of climate change? We certainly are putting efforts in to document changes we're seeing and track those, which will help us be better informed in the future. And then there are discussions, and depending on where or certain properties or certain features that we're managing, we can maybe implement some management adjustments, given what climate change is posing for us. So to answer your question, yes, that it is that, one of the higher considerations for us, and quite frightening to think about sometimes, is a threat that's, a very big picture global situation. A note I did this summer take a brief trip to Alaska and saw some of the glaciers there that were melting at an absolutely unprecedented rate. It's hard to wrap your mind around it till you see it. But standing there and watching, ice sheets that have been in place for more than 10,000 years disappear is quite sobering. So, we certainly all are very aware of that within our division and, planning, for the future on how best to handle it. So yeah, just to address those couple questions there, we'll touch on a few more things related to those here in a little bit. But here I'll show you some species at Cowbane, just to give you some examples. So you'll see these letters and numbers associated with the name of the species. This is the common name, it's the Baltic Rush. The S1 and G1. So the S1 is a state ranking system of 1 through 5 of the level, like whether it's imperiled or critically endangered or threatened. So the one being the most critically endangered would be a 1 level ranking. And then down to a 5 is just kind of just getting on the scale as far as, hey, we're seeing some decline or some issues here and we need to list this one. So same thing for the global ranking system as well. That's just the global ranking of that species. Where does it worldwide? How rare, how unique, how that species falls into the system there. So S1 state ranking, G5 global ranking. 1 being the most critically endangered on that scale, if that makes sense. So this is a unique rush here to the wet fen and the prairie at Cowbane that shows up here. And you can just see the dark green patches here, obviously associated with moisture conditions within the soil. And let's see, I'll jump on to the next one here. There we go. This is probably one of our most showy flowers here are for on this property called Queen of the Prairie. Obviously the name kind of gives it away as a prairie species, again, wet loving, but very beautiful, bright pink flowers at the end of May that bloom. And this is also a species that's only found in a few areas in Virginia. Obviously it's a state rank 2. And other than that, it's found down in the Midwest, Illinois, Indiana, in the prairie systems of the Midwest. So a very unique one to Virginia that is quite, just interesting to see as it blooms in May. It, can fill up a good portion of the wet prairie there at Cowbane and be quite showy. Another one here called Marsh pea. This is a pretty rare state one. Another just really attractive flower that grows in the fen as well. Globally not as critical, but to the state of Virginia, it's one that's critically endangered there for sure. And then I think the last one here, Rattlesnake Master. So this one is another common prairie species. And again, one kind of unique to certain areas in Virginia only. And then as far as an animal, we do have a bird, the king rail. We also have Virginia rails too, associated here. And unfortunately, we haven't observed king rails in quite some time. It's been probably close to a decade. Seen a lot of Virginia rails, but the king rails may change in their ranking status here. I'm not really sure why at this point that we haven't seen them there. More than likely just habitat degradation within the surrounding areas of the Cowbane Natural Area Preserve is contributing to that conversion of or draining of some of these wet areas for industrial development or agricultural use. Obviously without the habitat they need, being wet marshy areas to feed on the species they like to feed on, they obviously won't exist. So, but this is a unique one that has been a part of the Cowbane ecosystem for a while, but just hasn't been observed recently. All right, so we'll jump into our upland management here. This is a recent project. Currently, we're working off of some funding sources from a settlement. Some of you might be familiar with the DuPont settlement that from the South River. They had a textile plant that dumped high loads of mercury into the South River system for many years back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And a recent settlement with them, with the state of Virginia, came out for several $100 million. And all the state natural resource agencies applied with projects to that pool of money to pitch restoration within the Shenandoah Valley, the South River watershed specifically. So we started this upland grassland restoration project. I'm going to show you a few slides of how that kind of took place. So this is just a project that's taken particular interest for me because I kind of started it and hope to see it, kind of to the end, see it to fruition there. And we're already kind of seeing some excellent results. I'll show you this first picture here. This is just an aerial view of a fire burning across the prairie. So this is one of our primary management tools here. In a prairie system, fire would have burned through on average every 1.5 years as far as the return interval. So we try to mimic that here. Fire was a super common occurrence in the prairies of the Shenandoah Valley before settlement. And so continuing with using that tool for many benefits I won't really delve into here. I could probably talk about the benefits of fire for a whole presentation. So we'll just kind of touch on it briefly here, but this is a critical tool for us in managing the vegetation and the vigor of the species contained within these prairie systems. So one of the first steps that we do in a restoration is utilize fire to give us a nice clean blank slate to work with. And also that nutrient cycling is very helpful in our replanting efforts as well. So I'll jump ahead here. My computer's freezing a little bit, so I'm having to cycle through. So this is one of our staff members here burning a section of the unrestored prairie that contained, we talked about those, that Missouri strain of big blue stem that kind of created a monoculture. This is in, I think, February, so the snows kind of beat it down some, but it's still quite thick and dense, way higher of a density than you would ever find in a natural setting in Virginia. The strain of grass from Missouri is just very aggressive in Virginia because of soil types and chemistry and other things. So we wanted to take this about 20-acre chunk here and convert it back to a native mix of grasses and forbs that you would historically have found here in the Shenandoah Valley. So this is the beginning of the process, is kind of removing that thick, overly dense layer of grass that was present on site. We probably saw, I would say maybe a total of 2 to 3 forb species in this field in its entirety. The grass did an excellent job of suffocating out pretty much anything else. So outside of good wildlife cover, there really wasn't a lot of benefit to this field system. So just to give you an example of, burning things off, it just gives us that clean slate to start with. What we need for planting of native species is we need good seed to soil contact on the ground. So this allows us to burn off that thatch, a thick layer of grass, return those nutrients back into the top layer of the soil and give us a good starting point for our planting. So here you can see this is a worm season drill specifically designed for planting native worm season grasses that have a very fluffy seed. More of a traditional type drill you'd think of for agriculture or for row crops. The seeds are larger and hard and don't have the awns on them. And so you need a specialized drill. So this system contains several seed boxes that we have our forb seeds in and then our grass seed in, and scratches a very light scar in the soil, kind of pushes whatever thatch is left to the side, and then deposits our grass and forb seeds onto the surface of the soil. And then you can see these, what do they call, the packer wheels here that will just gently press those seeds into the soil. Native worm season grass and forb seeds don't need to be planted very deep at all. If even to use the term deep, literally they just need to be sprinkled on top of bare soil and maybe lightly pressed at the most. So we found our best technique here is we're actually planting in January, which seems odd. But given the natural timing of when native forbs and grasses are releasing their seeds in the fall and winter, they're being deposited on the ground, and then allowing for the freeze and thaw action of the top layer of that soil over the winter months to kind of work that seed into the soil just enough. So we really don't ever want to see a seed planted deeper than 1/4 of an inch. And really, I think that's probably too much from our experience. So they're just kind of scratching the surface, pressing it with this seed drill here onto the surface of the soil, and then letting nature take its course till spring, where you see, the germination at that point. So this field here is that 20-acre field that we burned off, and then over the course of the next couple of months, it kind of broke down, and the material flattened out over time with some rains and snows and all that, and so we're kind of left with the desired soil surface condition. So the next picture here is boom. So this is the same field 2 growing seasons later. So we've got a native big bluestem species here. There's also a native little bluestem in the mix as well as Indian grass. And then we've got a host of all kinds of forbs, butterfly milkweed. We've got some daisy species in there. We've got some goldenrods coming up and all blooming at different times. So this is the end result. This is what what we're shooting for. So in 2 years, we went from a field that was nothing but solid grass to this diverse assemblage of different species and plants. So we picked a mix of, I think, 12 different forbs and 3 or 4 different grasses native to this exact area of the state, as close as we could get. Most of these species are being, were derived from Virginia strains and grown by one of 2 companies that we work with, Ernst Seed Company, and then I'm going to draw a blank on the one out of Kentucky, Roundstone Seed Company out of Kentucky. So these mixes are coming from either of those 2, depending on seed availability. But so this is kind of the end result. So this is a project, a restoration project with funding from that settlement to pay for the seed. The seeds are very, very, very expensive. Would not have been able to complete this project without those funds, just because it's cost prohibitive because of the seed. So this gives you an example of kind of what a type of a project we may do on an NAP. We have a site from the data we've collected that we want to restore. And so we went from what you saw in the first slide to this. And so we'll maintain this over time, primarily with fire. These species are fire adapted or fire dependent, some of them even. And so we will routinely, every other year, rotate burn units within this system to keep this functioning as it is, on throughout time. So that will be our primary tool. We do use chemicals, which we'll talk about that, to manage some species and other mechanical means, but in a prairie system, our ideal state is to be able to establish our mix of native species and then use a natural element there, fire, to manage on into the future. Just give you another example, switching areas of the state to Difficult Creek Natural Area Preserve in Halifax County. This is a site that's much larger, a couple thousand acres, I believe, in total, and ever growing. A lot of commercial timberlands, essentially. So I think you're seeing a stand of a mix, but a stand of mostly loblolly pine in here, a plantation that, given the inventories work here and the data collection again, was once a prairie system. And so it's been converted to timberlands. And so this is kind of a starting state for us, a piece that we wanted to restore. And so you can see it's kind of just a monoculture again, a moonscape in the understory of this pine plantation. Very little diversity at all. Probably a mix of a few invasive species in there, shrubs and forbs that need to be dealt with. So the next step for us a lot of times is actually a commercial thinning operation. And so sometimes a lot of people are surprised that, given it's a natural area preserve and, protection is our main goal. But a lot of times protecting certain communities and species requires, pretty big move to manage that effectively. So a lot of times we'll come in and remove the non-native vegetation. These are genetically modified pitch lob pines a lot of times, which is a cross between a pitch pine and a loblolly pine, where they may just be straight loblolly, which in these parts of the state is not a native tree species. An excellent timber species for producing lumber, but it is not a native species to this part of the state. So we start by selectively removing the non-native trees like the loblolly pine. Here you see coming out and very carefully done under a watchful eye of stewards throughout the state, such as myself. And that's kind of sometimes our first step. So either before or after, we obviously will introduce fire. Again, prairie systems, are very dependent on fire. So we will come in a lot of times and burn through before we thin, and then obviously burning after as well. So this is a shot from Difficult Creek here. Looks like a unit that has not been thinned yet, getting an initial burn to kind of knock down or remove some of the layer of invasive plants that may be in there that make them easier to manage once we conduct a thinning operation. So here, post-thin, post-burn, you can see we've removed that pine there, leaving some of the native hardwoods, looks like they're in the mix. And so just an image of what it looks like after a fire passes through and those trees are removed. We've created some light gaps and getting more light on the forest floor, thinning out the density of trees over time will help us start to shift back towards what would be a savanna or a prairie type system on this preserve. So here's an example of that same stand we looked at. We talked about herbicide use, chemical use a little bit earlier, but here is where, again, we can come in and help speed up that process of shifting the ecosystem back towards a prairie system. So we've pulled out a lot of the overstory and done some chemical treatments on invasive species, a shrub that's always a problem for us. I think you can see probably would be one right here that's dead, has been treated. Targeted treatment of a herbicide is autumn olive more than likely. It's a very common one we battle quite often. So fire, thinning, fire, herbicide gets us to the state you see here. So we've got some native forbs coming in, grasses showing up, tufts of little blue stem showing up here. And a lot of times in these former prairie systems, you peel back the carpet of non-native vegetation and you release the seed bank of just all sorts of wonderful native grassland species that just respond from the seed bank immediately. So nothing has been planted here. Essentially, the prescription you see above is all that's happened here. We have just released that seed bank that was waiting, obviously to get that sunlight and soil warmth that it needed to be able to grow. And just some examples here. One of our key species that we manage for on Difficult Creek is smooth coneflower. And so you can see them responding, from the seed bank as well. Again, these are all shots from this property. Here again, seeing some, results from that same unit of thinning and burning there. The grasses responding, Rattlesnake Master here responding. It's also found at Difficult Creek. This is actually a power line right of way that we burn through and manage as well on site there. That's got some native species they're showing themselves there after management as well. So just kind of taking you from ground zero all the way to kind of desired condition that we want to maintain. We talked earlier about just species richness and biodiversity. We went from a very limited site as far as diversity of loblolly pines, a few sweet gums, and some greenbrier to a whole host of native forms and grasses and other species that are filling in after management. So there's a lot that goes into these processes. It makes it pretty simple to just show some PowerPoint slides and some photos, bam, 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 here it is. But there is a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that go into getting to this point. And it is quite the process to get there. So just keep that in mind. It is, it's why it takes many of us, our stewards and our other staff. We have operational stewards that work underneath of the regional stewards, and then part-time wage staff as well. Partnership groups that work together, volunteer groups that work together for invasive species management or implementing fire or timber operations, all take an immense amount of coordinating and logistical work to get done. So it was just showing you the culmination kind of all those efforts. So I think our last example here, just a little different spin. We'll talk about some of the ecological restoration here, but also this is an open access preserve. We'll talk kind of a little bit about how natural heritage works to provide that access for the public as well. So this is Buffalo Mountain Natural Area Preserve. This is down outside of Roanoke. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's one of the more popular hikes in the area. Just a beautiful 360-degree views of the Ridge and Valley there near Roanoke from the top of this mountain. And fortunately, there are some very unique and rare plant species that also are found in this area as well on the top of the bald there. So it's about 1,400 acres, pretty high in elevation, and that a lot of our rare species up there are tied to that high elevation site. They're kind of disjunct from more northern communities. So the peak there approaching 4,000 feet. For Virginia, that's a pretty tall mountain. You're getting up into that more northern type of ecosystem up there. So yeah, we've got 9 communities up there that are listed for us, 15 rare plants and 3 rare animals. So we call those, just for your reference too, internally, we call those EOs. That's an acronym for element occurrence. So that's our title for anything rare, unique. Our saying is in natural heritage is, let's see, I had it written down here. Somebody told it to me the other day, it's the last of the least and the best of the rest. That's kind of our, someone developed that internally as our kind of our tagline of what we do. So the last of the least and the best of the rest. So a lot of times we manage for really good quality examples of what might be a more common group of plant species. There may be a lot of them, but we have a really, really good high quality example of it. We want to protect those. But if we have a very small amount of a very rare species, we also want to protect those. So that kind of that tagline of the last of the least and the best of the rest kind of covers that. So here's a shot from the top of Buffalo Mountain. I've got some of those species in front of us that are tied to this site specifically. Just an absolutely beautiful area and one of our highest visitation sites from the public. So high elevation outcrop barren is the community that's protected there, and then is an S1G1, so a very high on the list there as far as critically endangered system as a whole. 6 rare plants and 3 rare animals in these 2 communities specifically. So here, the 3-tooth cinquefoil S2G5, this is one that grows within the outcrops. You can see the map over here gives you a breakdown of that critically imperiled down to an S5, which would be considered secure. And the map here shows you where we lie within that as far as the conservation status goes. So again, more northern species, really with any of these that I'm going to show you, West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee or South Carolina are all tied to their high elevation habitats within the Blue Ridge, so the northern southern Blue Ridge. And again, just a good shot here of that particular species growing within the rocks. That three-toed cinquefoil there. And then the other one here, again, if you look down at the map, those states there, obviously disjunct from more northern areas found in Newfoundland and Maine and just Quebec and those other areas that would find cooler temperatures and just a different climate overall that we see only at high elevations here in Virginia. So another, again, state rare, and then a pretty high global ranking as well. And just another shot of it here flowering. And we'll talk a little bit about the management of this. As you can see, it's kind of looks like it's growing in the balls on top, and we get quite a bit of visitor traffic there, and have noted through our inventory staff and our own observations, quite a bit of trampling from the high visitation of the public and a reduction in the presence of these couple of species on these balls. So here's an example of an area where the trail kind of comes out on the top of the mountain, and it's just, this used to be covered with those species, and now it's just been trampled to death by public access there on top of the mountain. So obviously we see a need to adjust or adapt, and one of the other things that we work with is people management on our property. So how to get them in and get them out. They can see the beautiful places that we manage that are here for their enjoyment, but without resource damage, without hurting those species we want to make sure we protect and keep vigorous on these sites. So another example of just the bank sliding away from foot traffic. Surprising how quickly it can happen depending on the volume of people going off and creating their own trails where they see fit. And so in an effort to mitigate this, we decided to establish a new trail system based off of the existing one that would help keep people where they need to be and away from these sensitive spots, but still being able to enjoy the site. So just kind of an existing map here of a few trails zigzagging all over the place. And we had people cutting corners, we call them social trails, cutting across to this trail over here, or taking a shortcut through here, and then obviously trampling the entire area up on top of the ridge here. So just needed to streamline things and clear things up a little bit there. Yeah, I see somebody saying it's one of their favorite places to visit. So I knew some of you would have been here before. It's one of the top places to see probably in this area of the state. All right, so you can just see this part of our trail construction project here is starting by cutting the tread, getting it on the right grade to be able to handle rainfall and water on it, and then also foot traffic. So this just gives you an idea of the process of creating that. Here is us working on this site. And then building stairs, again, trying to help keep people from wanting to cut corners or leave the trail system. We've had to implement certain tactics like building stairs and directing people to the right locations. So again, just putting in sign markers and giving people the idea where they need to be and should be is also part of the process. And then getting to the top, this posed a challenge, trying to keep people in certain areas. So we did come in and very carefully put in some railings and some rope barriers and signage to keep people from scattering all over the place at the top of the mountain. And so here's a shot at the end with our signage and ropes in place to help keep them where they need to be. So this is a pretty big undertaking, as a mile or two of trail that we had to develop and build from, kind of from scratch to get it right, to be able to handle the traffic. And then, up on top here, placing these pins as well in for the rope system was quite a task. And you can see here again, just keeping people where they should be. So before we leave that, we did see a huge increase in just the density of those couple of rare plant species once we got the people off that ridge top from trampling the areas that we didn't want them to go. So there was an immediate response from the plants there to reinfest that site, which we were obviously happy to see. So just real quick, I hit one more, and we're running out of time here. I'll hit one more. This is where we talk about some herbicide work. So we have a matic seep here, there as well, and just some of the invasive work in that. So, we deal with a lot of invasive species management, which sometimes ranges down to hand clipping, a mechanical method, hand clipping within other, rare plant communities that have invasives mixed in, and we can't really target them with herbicide applications. We'll come in and hand remove them if necessary. So very intensive, but on a small scale, one of the most effective. So we also will come in, you can see this is Brian Clough here, our mountain region steward. In these sensitive areas, again, we'll come in and actually trim out a species and then put herbicide on the cambium of the bark of that species specifically. So painting it on, very targeted, very low volume applications will kill that plant specifically, but leave everything else alone surrounding. And so that's another very targeted technique we utilize there as well. So we spend a lot of time doing this. Treating invasives is an ongoing process. It's a constant war. A lot of these properties are surrounded by just acres and acres and acres of invasives, and we have these postage stamp oasis of unique features that we want to maintain, and we have to constantly battle those invasives. And so our effort is to get these communities into a state where we can keep an eye on them and monitor them and deal with invasives that pop up here and there, keep them suppressed as best we can. A lot of times it involves coming into a new site or a site that hasn't been worked in a while and really getting ahead again, getting ahead of the curve there and treating with mechanical and chemical treatment. And just real quick, a last slide here. Also, another element for us is education and outreach. So, involving volunteer groups. We've got a Boy Scouts troop here that helped us collect some native seed for a project. We've got tours that we're doing in our cave systems, our karst features that are contain unique rare species that we want people to be able to experience. Days where we have school groups come out and assist with trail building projects or invasive species management, just the whole host of projects and getting people out and getting them excited about Virginia and Virginia's natural resources and feeling like they play a part as well. So that's also a piece for us that we obviously have in the mix too. So this is probably one of the more enjoyable parts of the job is seeing people get out, experience our lands, develop a new appreciation for what Virginia has to offer, and kind of know what we are and what we do and why we do it. A lot of people don't. They lump a lot of our state agencies together. They don't know that the natural air preserve system exists. So that's also part of our job too, is that education and outreach that all of us in natural heritage take part in. So I think we're pretty much out of time. I went over a little bit. We've got a few minutes for questions. Wanted to allow a little more time, but that's it. And if you guys want to jump in for however much time we have left, I've got plenty of time here. So please feel free to ask any questions you might have.
Thanks so much, Tyler. That was really great presentation. It's so exciting to see the work being done throughout the state. We did have one question that came in about any books or resources you would recommend to get oriented with flora and fauna of Virginia, from someone who was a transplant from New England here to Virginia, but I think also for any of us who are interested in learning more about the species in Virginia.
Sure. Yeah. So research for that, I would also recommend you go to our website, the Natural Heritage website, and we have each preserve broken down there, and you can see the species associated with those preserves specifically. And so then from there, if you have one particular interest, there's also other links to descriptions of those rare and unique plants or communities that are associated with those NAPs that can give you a little more about them, the history of them and such. So that'd be a good place to start. There's also a text that was produced a few years ago by our chief biologist called The Flora and Fauna of Virginia. For those of you that are, maybe educated or schooled in using a dichotomous key for plant identification, that contains pretty much everything in Virginia. It's a huge document that was put into text there. So that would be a good source for those of you maybe that would like to look from that way. And outside of that, just getting some local, identification guides specific to Virginia would be helpful. Don't think I have any off the top of my head that I would recommend, but I think the best starting point would be for our website there with the NAPs listed, and then tying to the descriptions of the species that we've got in Virginia. There just gives you good pictures, and then where are they, and then just kind of background on that species.
Great. Thank you so much. And there's been a lot of thanks in the chat box for your presentation. So we really appreciate your time and you joining us this morning.
Sure. Yeah, no, you're very welcome. I know there was a lot, and it's hard because there's so many different things that we could talk about and go into. So I hope to give you kind of just a good quick synopsis of us as a whole as a division, and a little more in depth on stewardship and how we operate, what kind of things we do. So I hope that was helpful.
Great. Well, thank you, Tyler, and thanks to everyone who joined us this morning. We appreciate your time, and we will see you in a future EMG webinar.
Okay, great. Thank you all very much. Enjoy your day.